In the spring of 1863, amid the blood-soaked fields of Virginia, where brother fought brother in the war between the states, a different kind of devastation unfolded within the walls of Belmont Plantation, one that would consume an entire family from within, leaving behind only whispers of shame and the ghosts of those who suffered in silence. What transpired on those 840 acres of tobacco and wheat would become a cautionary tale buried beneath layers of Confederate nostalgia, a story the Old South desperately wished to forget but could never truly escape. You are now part of Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slave-holding era, tales that reveal the true moral cost of a system built on human bondage, and the destruction it wrought upon both the enslaved and those who claimed dominion over them. Belmont stood 3 miles southeast of Charlottesville, a modest estate by Virginia standards but prosperous nonetheless, with approximately 140 souls held in bondage working the tobacco fields and maintaining the household operations that kept the Ashford family in comfort. Colonel Marcus Ashford, 47 years of age in that fateful year, had inherited the property from his father in 1851 and had run it with what he considered a firm but fair hand, a delusion common among men who measured fairness by the absence of the whip rather than the presence of freedom. Educated at the College of William and Mary, well-read in classical literature and scripture, Colonel fancied himself a philosopher-planter, a man who understood the burden of his civilizing mission, even as the institution he defended crumbled around him with each Union victory. His wife, Eleanor Ashford, had died in childbirth in 1856, leaving him with 3 sons, Thomas, aged 21 and serving with the Virginia Cavalry, William, 19, recently returned home after losing his left arm at Fredericksburg, and Charles, just 17, too young, yet for military service, but burning with the same martial ardor that had claimed so many young men of his generation. The household had been maintained in Eleanor's absence by the colonel's sister, Miss Josephine Ashford, a spinster of 42, whose piety was matched only by her conviction that slavery represented God's natural order, a temporary apprenticeship through which an inferior race might be gradually elevated toward civilization. Among the enslaved population of Belmont, none occupied a more complicated position than Hattie, a woman of 28 years, whose light complexion and delicate features betrayed the violent history that plagued so many plantations across the South. Born on the estate to a woman named Ruth, and seated by the colonel's own father during one of his nocturnal visits to the quarters, Hattie had grown up in the shadow of the great house, trained from childhood in the domestic arts, serving as personal maid to Eleanor Ashford until that lady's death, and subsequently attending to the colonel's sister, and managing the household's inner workings with quiet efficiency. Hattie's position afforded her certain privileges: better clothing, lighter work, a small room in the main house rather than the crowded quarters where most of the enslaved population slept. But these advantages came with their own particular torments. She could read, having been taught secretly by Eleanor Ashford, who had possessed abolitionist sympathies. She dared not voice aloud but expressed through small acts of subversion. She understood the poetry the colonel quoted at dinner, recognized the hypocrisy in the sermons Miss Josephine read aloud each Sunday morning. She knew, with a knowledge that burned like acid in her chest, that the blood running through her veins made her half-sister to the very man who claimed ownership of her body and soul. The household also included Ezra, a man of 35, who served as the colonel's personal valet, dignified and careful in his movements, his intelligence visible in eyes that revealed nothing. Dinah, aged 42, who ruled the kitchen with authority born of irreplaceable skill, her repetees and preserves the envy of neighboring plantations. Moses, 24, the blacksmith, whose powerful frame and quiet intensity made even overseers cautious in their approach. Celia, Hattie's closest confidante, 19 years old, who worked in the laundry and possessed a voice of heartbreaking beauty that rose from the quarters on Sunday evenings. Abel, 16, stable hand and son to Dinah, quick-witted and daring in ways that worried those who cared for him. Patience, 51, the eldest among them, midwife and healer, whose knowledge of roots and herbs made her indispensable despite her advancing years, and young Samuel, merely 12, who ran errands between the house and fields, absorbing everything with the sharp awareness of a child forced to grow up too quickly. The trigger for the catastrophe that would engulf them all came on a humid evening in late May, when Colonel Ashford, deep in his cups and brooding over dispatches that spoke of further Confederate setbacks, called Hetty to his study under the pretense of dictation. What occurred in that lamplight room had occurred before. The colonel's attentions toward Hattie had begun shortly after his wife's death, and had continued sporadically over the years, each violation justified in his mind by the laws that declared her property and therefore incapable of being wrong. But on this particular night, William entered the study, seeking his father's signature on a letter, and found them in circumstances that could not be misunderstood. The young man, his empty sleeve pinned neatly at the shoulder, stood frozen in the doorway, and in his face, Hattie saw reflected the destruction of some fundamental illusion about his father's character. William said nothing, simply turned and left, but his silence carried more weight than any accusation. The colonel, sobered instantly by shame and rage, struck Hattie across the face and ordered her from the room, as if punishing her might somehow purge his own guilt. She fled to her small chamber, tasting blood in her mouth, knowing that something irrevocable had shifted in the household's delicate equilibrium. Pause for a moment and reflect on this. In a world where human beings were reduced to property, where even the most intimate violations carried no legal consequence, how did those who suffered such treatment maintain any sense of self? The enslaved people of the South navigated daily through moral wilderness, where their very humanity was denied, yet somehow preserved their dignity in the face of unrelenting degradation. In the days that followed, William began to drink heavily, seeking oblivion in his father's brandy, his eyes haunted by knowledge he could not know. Charles, sensing his brother's torment, but unable to divine its source, grew increasingly volatile, picking fights with the house servants over imagined slights. Miss Josephine moved through the household with pursed lips and suspicious glances, aware that some disturbance had upset the domestic order, but unable to identify its nature. The colonel himself withdrew into icy formality, avoiding Hattie entirely while issuing increasingly arbitrary commands to the other enslaved members of the household. It was during this period of tension that William began seeking out Hattie's company, initially to apologize for his father's behavior, to express shame at having witnessed her degradation. These conversations, conducted in whispered tones in the pantry or the rear hallway when others were occupied elsewhere, gradually became more frequent and more intimate. William, damaged by war and carrying his own burden of shame about his father's character, found in Hattie an unexpected confidante, someone who understood loss and helplessness, who listened without judgment to his confused admissions of doubt about the cause for which he had sacrificed his arm. For Hattie, these encounters represented dangerous ground. She recognized in William's attention both genuine human connection and the potential for further exploitation, yet she was not without her own needs, the hunger for conversation with someone who saw her as more than property, the desperate desire to be recognized as fully human. In the suffocating atmosphere of Belmont, where every relationship was poisoned by the power imbalance inherent in slavery, even this flawed connection offered a glimpse of something approaching mutual regard. By midsummer, their meetings had progressed beyond conversation. William, consumed by needs he could barely articulate, the desire to distinguish himself from his father, to claim something his father had touched, but to do so through choice rather than force, to feel some connection in a world that had taken his arm and was slowly taking his sanity, began to court Hattie with a strange formality, as if their respective positions could be temporarily forgotten. He brought her small gifts, a book of poetry, a blue ribbon, objects that would have been unremarkable in any other context, but which carried enormous risk in their circumstances. She accepted these tokens with a mixture of gratitude and dread, knowing that affection between enslaved and enslaver could never be anything but corrupted by the institution that defined their relationship. If you find yourself drawn into these forgotten stories, these stories of America's original sin that shaped the nation we live in today, please subscribe to Shadows of the South so you can continue to explore the hidden tragedies that still echo through our present. Charles, the youngest son, had been watching his brother's transformation with growing suspicion. One afternoon in August, following William through the house, he witnessed an exchange between his brother and Hattie that confirmed his worst fears. Unlike William's horrified reaction to discovering their father's behavior, Charles's response was one of outrage, rooted in the racial hierarchies he had absorbed since childhood. In his mind, his brother's attention toward Hattie represented not a moral failure equivalent to their father's but something worse, a betrayal of white supremacy itself, a willing descent into forbidden intimacy that violated every principle he had been taught to hold sacred. Charles confronted William that evening in the library, and their argument escalated into physical violence, the younger brother's fury driving him to strike his maimed sibling repeatedly until Ezra and Moses, hearing the commotion, intervened to separate them. The colonel, summoned by the disturbance, demanded an explanation, and Charles, still breathing hard with rage, revealed everything, not only William's current involvement with Hattie, but also the original scene of their father's transgression that William had witnessed months before. The story fell silent as the colonel absorbed this information, his face darkening with a complex mixture of shame, anger, and fear. Miss Josephine, who had followed the commotion, stood in the doorway with her hand pressed to her chest, her expression a portrait of scandalized horror. The domestic order she had worked so carefully to maintain, the respectable facade that allowed her to believe in the righteousness of their way of life, had been shattered by the exposure of behaviors she had perhaps always suspected but never allowed herself to fully acknowledge. Consider for a moment the psychological torment inherent in this system. Families who proclaimed their Christian virtue, while committing acts that violated every teaching of Christ, who spoke of honor and duty, while participating in a regime built on the systematic brutalization and sexual exploitation of those they claimed were lesser beings. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain such a worldview inevitably produced madness, a moral rot that consumed from within. The colonel's response, when it finally came, was characteristic of men in his position. Rather than confronting his own culpability, he sought to eliminate the evidence of his family's transgressions. He announced that Hattie would be sold immediately to a trader passing through Charlottesville, removing her from the household before her presence could cause further damage to his son's moral development or his family's reputation. Miss Josephine nodded her approval, satisfied that decisive action was being taken to restore proper boundaries. Charles looked grimly vindicated. William said nothing, but the color drained from his face. Hattie learned of her impending sally from Dinah, who had overheard the decision while serving supper. The news struck with the force of a physical blow. She would be torn from the only home she had known, separated from Celia and the others who formed her community, sold downriver to God knew what fate. The romantic notion that William might somehow prevent this, might declare his feelings and challenge his father's authority, proved as illusory as every other hope she had been foolish enough to entertain. In the slave system, sentiment counted for nothing against property rights and family reputation. That night, William did attempt to intervene, pleading with his father to reconsider, offering to leave Belmont himself if that would allow Hattie to remain. The colonel, interpreting this desperate offer as confirmation of his son's dangerous attachment, refused absolutely, declaring that the matter was closed and that William needed to remember his position and duty. The young man, still recovering from his battlefield injuries and weakened by months of heavy drinking, could do nothing but retreat to his room, where he wept with the helpless rage of someone finally recognizing the monstrous nature of the world he had been defending. The trader was scheduled to arrive on the morning of September 2nd. On the evening of September 1st, as the household prepared for bed, William took his father's revolver from the study desk, walked quietly through the darkened house to Hattie's small room, and asked her to come with him. Perhaps he imagined they might flee together into the night, escaping into Union territory, where she would be free and they might build some impossible life together. Perhaps he simply wanted to speak with her one final time, to apologize for his weakness and his family's cruelty. What he actually intended remains unknowable, lost to history, along with so many other intimate tragedies of that era. What is known is that Charles, unable to sleep and suspicious of his brother's state of mind, heard movement in the house and emerged from his own room to find William and Hattie in the rear hallway, speaking in urgent whispers. The younger brother, fueled by self-righteous fury and armed with a hunting knife he had taken to carrying since the earlier altercation, confronted them, demanding to know what degeneracy William was now planning. William, pushed beyond endurance by shame and grief and rage, raised the pistol, whether to threaten his brother or to keep him from raising an alarm is unclear, but Charles lunged forward with the knife, and in the confused struggle that followed, the revolver discharged. The shot woke the household. The colonel reached the hallway first, lamp in hand, to find Charles on the floor with blood spreading across his nightshirt, William standing frozen with the smoking pistol, and Hattie pressed against the wall, her hands covering her mouth to stifle her screams. Charles lived long enough to accuse his brother of murder, to declare with his dying breath that William had been bewitched by a mongrel slave and had sacrificed his own blood to protect her. The boy died in his father's arms, while Miss Josephine shrieked and prayed, and Ezra stood at a careful distance, his face carefully neutral, despite the chaos unfolding before him. reflect on the terrible arithmetic of slavery, a system so corrupting that it could turn brother against brother, could drive young men raised in the same household to lethal violence, could make murder seem preferable to acknowledging shared humanity across the artificial barrier of race. The institution destroyed not only those it enslaved, but also those who benefited from it, poisoning relationships and perverting natural affection into possessive violence. William made no attempt to deny what had occurred, though he insisted through his tears that the shooting had been accidental, the result of Charles's attack, rather than any murderous intent. The colonel, cradling his dead son's body, looked at his surviving son with an expression of such hatred and devastation that even those enslaved witnesses who had suffered under his authority felt a moment of involuntary pity. Miss Josephine, her face a mask of horror, pointed at Hattie and declared the author of this catastrophe, the temptress who had corrupted both father and sons, the embodiment of the dangerous proximity that slavery created between the races. The colonel, his voice hollow with grief and rage, ordered Moses and Abel to lock William in his room while he considered what must be done. He then turned to Hattie, and for a moment his face worked with some emotion too complex to name, anger certainly, but also guilt and a kind of terrible recognition. He ordered Ezra to take her to the small storage building near the stables and lock her inside until the trader's arrival in the morning, declaring that she would be sold as planned and that the entire household was forbidden to speak of the night's events to anyone. But by dawn, William had hanged himself in his room using a rope fashioned from torn bedsheets, leaving behind a letter addressed to his father that contained both confession and accusation. The document, which would later be destroyed by Miss Josephine, reportedly detailed not only the circumstances of Charles's death, but also condemned the institution of slavery itself, the moral corruption it engendered, and his father's hypocrisy in particular. He wrote of his time in the army, of watching men die, for a cause he had gradually come to see as fundamentally evil, of losing his arm in defense of his stem built on cruelty and sexual exploitation. He declared that Hattie had shown him more genuine human kindness than he had found in his own family, and that he could not live in a world where such goodness was treated as property. He asked God's forgiveness and stated that he hoped his death might somehow serve as penance for his family's sins. The colonel found his son's body and read the letter, and something fundamental broke within him. Within hours, he had sent the trader away without completing the sale, had summoned the local magistrate and sheriff, and had confessed everything: Charles' death, William's suicide, his own violations of Hattie, and the corrupt dynamics that had destroyed his family. The confession served no legal purpose regarding the treatment of Hattie, as no crime could be charged for what he had done to property, but it did expose him to scrutiny and judgment from his social peers that he seemed suddenly desperate to receive. The scandal that erupted consumed Charlottesville society for months. Miss Josephine fled to relatives in Richmond, unable to bear the whispers and stares that followed her at church. The colonel, broken by grief and guilt, began to deteriorate rapidly, drinking heavily and neglecting the plantation's operations. By December of that year, with Union forces advancing and the Confederate cause visibly collapsing, he had sold most of his enslaved workforce to cover debts, retaining only a skeleton crew to maintain basic operations. Hattie freed outright, providing her with manumission papers and a small sum of money, an act that was either genuine repentance or a final attempt to assuage his guilt. by disposing of the evidence of his crimes. She left Belmont in January 1864, making her way north toward Washington, where refugee slaves were gathering under Union protection. Celia accompanied her, and together they found work in a contraband camp, later moving to Philadelphia, where they lived together until Celia's death from influenza in 1871. Hattie never married, never returned to Virginia, and never spoke publicly about her experiences at Belmont, though she did leave behind a journal, discovered by researchers in the 1960s, that provided the detailed account upon which much of this narrative is based. The colonel died in April 1865, just days before Lee's surrender at Appomattox, his estate heavily mortgaged, and his reputation destroyed. Belmont itself fell into disrepair and was eventually sold for back taxes in 1868. The house burned to the ground in 1872 under circumstances that were never explained, though local black residents later claimed it was deliberately set alight by former slaves who wanted to eradicate the seat of so much suffering. No monument marks the location today, and few residents of modern Charlottesville know the history of the land where a shopping center now stands. Ezra survived the war and lived until 1891, working as a carpenter in Charlottesville and serving as a deacon in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Dinah and Abel made their way to Baltimore, where she established a successful catering business that served the city's black middle class. Moses fought with the United States colored troops and died of disease in a military hospital in 1864. Patience remained in Virginia, continuing her work as a midwife and healer until her death in 1873. Samuel, who witnessed the household's destruction as a boy, became a teacher during Reconstruction and lived to see the 20th century, dying in 1919 with the memory of Belmont's tragedy still fresh despite more than 50 years of distance. Take a moment to understand what this story represents, not an aberration, not an unusual case, but a pattern repeated across thousands of plantations throughout the South. The Ashford family's destruction was inevitable given the moral contradictions inherent in slaveholding. The daily proximity between enslaver and enslaved, the sexual violence normalized by law and custom, the psychological torture of declaring some humans property while recognizing their fundamental humanity in private moments. The system could not sustain itself without producing exactly this kind of tragedy, multiplied across generations and regions until the entire structure collapsed in war. We tell these stories, not to entertain, but to remember, to ensure that the truth of America's original sin is never whitewashed by nostalgia for moonlight and magnolias. The Old South, that some mourn, was built on atrocities large and small, on the destruction of families, on the abolition of bodies and spirits, on a lie so fundamental that it poisoned everything it touched. The Ashford family's fate reveals what abolitionists of the era understood, and what modern Americans must never forget. Slavery corrupted everyone involved in it, destroying enslaver and enslaved alike, though of course the suffering was never equal or equivalent. Hattie's journal, now housed in the Library of Congress, contains a passage written in Philadelphia in 1867 that serves as her own epitaph for Belmont. I do not rejoice in their suffering, though they never questioned mine. I do not celebrate the destruction of that house, though it destroyed so many. I simply record what slavery produces, not only in chains and auction blocks, but in the intimate spaces where human beings are forced into proximity without equality, where power corrupts absolutely, and where the master's authority extends even into his own family's destruction. The Ashfords died by their own hands, but slavery loaded the pistol and tied the nose. My God, have mercy on all our souls, for we have built a nation on sand, and it will take generations to find solid ground again. The story of Hattie and the Ashford family stands as testament to a truth that the post-war South worked desperately to obscure, that the institution of slavery damaged everyone it touched, creating psychological torments and moral disasters that no amount of lost cause mythology could rehabilitate. In our examination of such stories, we confront not only the crimes of the past, but also the work of healing that remains incomplete, the legacy of trauma that persists in American society, the ongoing struggle to acknowledge what was done and to build something better on the ruins. These stories reveal the true price of unchecked power, the cost of reducing human beings to property, and the inevitable destruction that follows when a society builds itself on fundamental lies about human worth and dignity. As we continue to unearth these forgotten stories, we are reminded that the past is never truly past, that the choices made in those tobacco fields and plantation houses still echo in our laws, our culture, and our continuing struggle with the meaning of equality and justice. If this story has moved you to reflection, if you recognize the importance of remembering these stories rather than burying them, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts on how we reckon with this difficult past, and consider what responsibility we bear today to understand the foundations upon which our nation was built, however uncomfortable that understanding might be. The dead cannot speak for themselves, but we can choose to listen to what they left behind and to learn from their suffering what systems of power and exploitation ultimately cost everyone involved. The shadows of the South are long and dark, stretching across more than a century and a half, touching lives and communities in ways both obvious and subtle. Only by bringing these stories into the light can we hope to dispel them, to move forward with clear vision rather than willful blindness, to build a society that truly honors the humanity of all its members rather than one that merely claims to do so while preserving the hierarchies and hatreds of the past.